The paper was still in Lillian Dawson's trembling hands when Louis Bailey walked through the door of the Sweetwater Creek land office, and the world stopped turning. She stood there in the dusty afternoon light of July 1882, her dark hair pinned back under a straw bonnet that had seen better days, her brown eyes wide and swimming with something that was not quite joy but was dangerously close to relief. She was clutching a folded document to her chest like it was a lifeline, and in a way it was. It was everything. It was the last hope she had left in a world that had taken nearly everything else from her. "You signed it," she said, and her voice broke on the last syllable. Louis Bailey stopped walking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and pale gray eyes that had a habit of seeing straight through people. He was 28 years old and had the look of a man who had buried too many things, regrets included. He took in the way she was holding that paper, the way her chin was lifted with a pride she was clearly fighting to maintain, the way her fingers had gone white at the knuckles, and something in his chest did an unfamiliar, inconvenient thing. "I did," he said carefully. "Then it is settled," Lillian said, and her voice was quiet and full of a fierce, private triumph. "We are to be married." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Louis Bailey had heard in years. He looked at her. He looked at the paper. He thought about the words printed on that contract, which she had clearly misread in a way so fundamental it should have been corrected immediately, that very second, before another breath was drawn in the airless heat of that office. He did not correct her. He told himself later that it was the shock. He told himself it was because she looked so desperate and so brave at the same time, standing there in a dress that was mended at the hem and shoes that were worn thin, with that document pressed to her heart like a prayer. He told himself a lot of things in the months that followed, but standing there in the Sweetwater Creek land office on that scorching July afternoon, watching Lillian Dawson's eyes fill with the first genuine relief he had ever seen on a human face, Louis Bailey made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He let her believe it. And everything that came after, every twist of fate and collision of secrets and dark history dragged into the light, every moment of fury and tenderness, and the slow, terrifying fall into something neither of them had planned, all of it began with that single, silent, devastating choice. To understand how they arrived at that moment, you had to go back 3 weeks, to the day the eastbound stage rolled into Sweetwater Creek with a woman who had nothing left but the address of a dead man written on a scrap of paper. Sweetwater Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1882, was not a town that invited sentiment. It sat on the flat, baked earth of the Panhandle like something that had been dropped there by accident and had not yet gotten around to leaving. There was a main street of hard-packed dirt that turned to mud when the rains came and cracked to something resembling broken pottery when they did not. There was a general store, a land office, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a saloon called the Red Ace, a livery stable, a small church that the pastor insisted on calling a cathedral despite having a congregation of 14, and a collection of homes that ranged from solid to optimistic. The town had been built on cattle and land speculation, and in 1882 both of those enterprises were doing well enough to keep Sweetwater Creek alive, if not exactly thriving. The great cattle drives up through Texas were still running, and men like Louis Bailey, who had the land and the means to support large herds, were among the most consequential figures in the region, whether they sought that consequence or not. Louis, for his part, did not seek it. He owned the Bailey Ranch, a spread of some 4,000 acres northwest of town that his father had built and that Louis had expanded in the decades since his father's death. He had done this methodically, without fanfare, acquiring adjacent parcels through legal purchase and sheer stubborn persistence. He employed 11 men full-time, ran a herd of nearly 800 cattle, and was known throughout Sweetwater Creek as a man of his word who was also, by most accounts, deeply and possibly permanently solitary. He was not unfriendly. He was not cruel. He simply had the quality of a man who had decided, At some point he could not now precisely identify, that closeness was a kind of risk he was no longer willing to accept. He came to town twice a week for supplies and business. He did not attend socials. He had not courted any of the women who had, over the years, expressed varying degrees of interest. He paid his men fairly, dealt honestly with his neighbors, and went home alone to a house that was, by any objective measure, far too large for one person. The dark past that kept Louis Bailey at that careful distance was not a secret in Sweetwater Creek, exactly, though the details varied depending on who was telling the story. The broad strokes were known. 5 years prior, his fiancée, a woman named Clara Holt, had left him. Not quietly, not kindly. She had taken up with a cattle broker from Abilene, a man named Preston Ford, and had done so in a manner so public and so final that the wound had never quite healed to smooth skin. There had been a scene. There had been words exchanged between Louis and Preston Ford that the witnesses remembered vividly for years afterward. There had been no violence, but only because Louis Bailey had an iron grip on himself, and everyone watching had understood that the iron grip was the only thing standing between the moment and something much worse. Clara and Preston Ford had left for Abilene 3 days later. Louis had gone back to his ranch. He had not spoken of it again. And the walls he built in the aftermath were so solid and so seamlessly constructed that most people eventually stopped looking for a way through. This was the man standing in the land office on that July afternoon when Lillian Dawson arrived in Sweetwater Creek with a mended dress and a scrap of paper and a misread contract. But before that confrontation, there was the stagecoach and the story that brought her here. Lillian Dawson was 24 years old in the summer of 1882, and she had been through enough in those 24 years to age a person considerably past their chronological number. She had grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, the daughter of a bookkeeper named George Dawson who had a talent for numbers and a weakness for whiskey that eventually conquered everything else. Her mother, Margaret, had died of fever when Lillian was 12. And from that point forward Lillian had managed the household, stretched the money, covered for her father's absences, and quietly educated herself from whatever books she could borrow or buy second-hand. George Dawson had died in March of 1882, leaving behind a stack of debts that was, to Lillian's horrified reckoning, approximately 4 times larger than the total value of everything they owned. The house was claimed by creditors. The furniture went. The bookkeeping business, such as it was, folded immediately without George at its center. Lillian was left with her personal belongings, a small amount of money she had saved over years of careful management, and the knowledge that she needed to find a solution quickly or she would be entirely destitute. The advertisement had appeared in the St. Louis Dispatch in April. Lillian had read it 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. Wanted. A capable, literate woman for the position of bookkeeper and land office administrator in Sweetwater Creek, Texas. The position is funded by a land grant and carries a living stipend and lodging. Apply in writing to Mr. Harold Graves, Graves Land Office, Sweetwater Creek, Texas. Lillian had applied immediately. She was, without false modesty, more than capable. She could keep books, organize records, manage correspondence, and had a mind for contracts and legal language that had developed out of years of reading and necessity. She received a reply from Harold Graves within 2 weeks, written in a cramped, enthusiastic hand, expressing delight at her qualifications and confirming the position. She sold what remained of her belongings, purchased a stage ticket to Texas, and arrived in Sweetwater Creek in early July to find that Harold Graves had died of a heart attack 4 days before her arrival. This was the catastrophe that had driven her to the land office that afternoon. Harold Graves was dead. The position he had advertised was gone with him. The living stipend and lodging existed only in the letter she had received, which had no legal standing now that Graves himself was in the ground. She was in a strange town with no connections, dwindling money, and the particular, cold terror of a woman who has burned her bridges and arrived to find the destination on fire. The acting land office administrator was a small, nervous man named Cecil Prout, who had taken over Harold Graves's office and his records and his paperwork with the enthusiasm of someone who had been handed a bucket of live snakes. Cecil Prout was kind, in a helpless sort of way. He had explained the situation with genuine regret and visible perspiration, and then, seemingly at a loss for what else to do, he had handed Lillian the stack of Harold Graves's pending correspondence to look through, on the grounds that she might as well make herself useful while she worked out her next step. It was in this stack that Lillian found the contract. It was a document relating to a land parcel adjacent to the Bailey Ranch, a piece of property called the Hendricks Plot after its former owner, a man named Samuel Hendricks who had died intestate the previous autumn. The Hendricks Plot was approximately 300 acres of good grazing land, and there were two parties interested in acquiring it. One was Louis Bailey, whose letter of intent was in the file, expressing interest in purchasing the land outright. The other was a man named Rupert Cassidy, who had filed a competing claim through a legal mechanism involving an old territorial preemption right that was, in Cecil Prout's anxious assessment, of uncertain validity. The contract that Lillian held was a draft agreement prepared by Harold Graves before his death, setting out terms for resolving the competing claims. It was dense with legal language, heavy with conditional clauses, and written in the kind of elaborate circumlocution that lawyers of the era favored when they were being paid by the word. Lillian read it carefully, as she read everything carefully, because she was thorough and precise by nature. And in that careful reading, somewhere in the second of 4 pages, she made the single error that changed everything. The document contained a clause about the settlement of the competing claims. One section, which Lillian read as relating to a binding partnership and shared interest in the property, was in fact a standard land transfer clause. The terminology was archaic, referencing a covenant of permanent union and mutual obligation that was a legal holdover from older property law, meaning nothing more than a joint deed arrangement. But to Lillian, reading quickly in the poor light of the land office, thinking in modern terms, seeing words like permanent union and covenant and binding obligation to provide and be provided for, the section read like something else entirely. It read like a marriage contract. And because she was desperate and grasping for solutions, because her mind was already turning over every possible way to secure a stable position in this town, because the idea that Harold Graves had set up some arrangement for her that she had not known about felt, in that exhausted, frightened moment, like the mercy of the universe finally extending a hand, she let herself believe it. She spent 20 minutes going back over the document, and each time she read it, her interpretation solidified. The party of the first part, identified as the landholder and provider, was Louis Bailey. The party of the second part, described as the recipient of covenant and shared interest, was identified by a blank space that Harold Graves had not yet filled in. But the cover letter attached to the draft, written in Graves's cramped hand, said clearly, "This arrangement has been prepared per the gentleman's agreement with the party traveling from St. Louis and is to be executed upon her arrival." The gentleman's agreement, the party traveling from St. Louis, upon her arrival. Lillian read that cover letter and felt the floor shift beneath her. Harold Graves had arranged this for her. Before he died, he had arranged a covenant of permanent union with Louis Bailey, a man who owned 4,000 acres and a solid ranch house and a future that looked nothing like the void she was staring into. A man who had, apparently, agreed to this arrangement. She had misread it entirely. The cover letter was actually referring to a female investor from St. Louis named Mrs. Patricia Hadley, who had been corresponding with Graves about a joint land venture with Bailey, and the covenant of permanent union was nothing more than a legal partnership clause. But Lillian did not know this. She walked into that land office with the contract and the cover letter, and the absolute certainty of someone who has read a document 3 times and is sure they understand it. And Louis Bailey, who knew exactly what that contract said, who had read his copy of the draft carefully and understood it to be nothing more than a land partnership arrangement, looked at this woman with her desperate eyes and her mended dress and her trembling, fierce certainty, and did not correct her. He told himself it was momentary. He would explain it in a moment. He would explain it in a minute. He would explain it as soon as he found the right words, which were surely just about to arrive. The moment passed. The words did not arrive, and Lillian Dawson looked at Louis Bailey with those dark brown eyes and said, "We are to be married," and something in him that had been shut for 5 years cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. The days that followed were the most complicated of Louis Bailey's adult life, and he had not previously thought that bar was set particularly low. He spent the first 24 hours constructing elaborate, detailed plans for how he would correct the misunderstanding. He would go back to town. He would speak to Cecil Prout. He would have Prout explain to Lillian that the contract was a land partnership document and that Harold Graves's cover letter had referred to someone else entirely. It would be mortifying for her, he understood that, but it would be kinder than allowing the misunderstanding to continue. He went to town the next morning. He walked into the land office. Cecil Prout was there, doing something complicated with a filing cabinet. Louis opened his mouth. And Lillian Dawson came out of the back room carrying a ledger book, and her face, when she saw him, did something he was completely unprepared for. It brightened. Not with the artificial brightness of a woman putting on a performance, but with the genuine, involuntary brightness of someone who has been frightened in the dark and has just seen a familiar light. She said, "Mr. Bailey, good morning," and her voice had a warmth in it that had not been there the day before, a warmth that came from the particular relief of a person who believes, against all recent evidence, that someone in the world is on their side. Louis Bailey stood there and felt the speech he had prepared evaporate entirely. He bought a bag of flour and left. This happened again the following day, and the day after that. Each time he arrived with a full complement of intentions to correct the misunderstanding, and each time something about the sight of her, the way she had made herself useful in that land office without being asked, reorganizing Graves's chaotic records into a system of clear efficiency, the way she asked him careful questions about the Hendricks plot and listened to his answers with genuine attention, the way she laughed once, briefly, at something Cecil Prout said. A laugh that was startled out of her like she had forgotten she could, undid his certainty, and sent him home having said nothing of consequence. By the end of the first week, Lillian was managing the Sweetwater Creek land office with a competence that had Cecil Prout alternating between profound relief and mild professional anxiety. She had organized 5 years of accumulated paperwork into a logical filing system. She had identified 3 land disputes that had been sitting unresolved in the pile for over a year and written clear summaries of each. She had begun a proper ledger of pending transactions and filed a formal request with the county seat in Amarillo for clarification on the Hendricks plot competing claim. The town, in the way that small western towns had of noting everything without appearing to note anything, had observed all of this and formed opinions. The opinions were, on the whole, favorable. Lillian Dawson was capable and quiet and did not appear to be involved in any scandal, which was more than could be said for several of Sweetwater Creek's other residents. The connection to Louis Bailey was noted with interest, because Louis Bailey was a topic of ongoing fascination in a town that did not have an abundance of entertainment. Rupert Cassidy noted it with something sharper than interest. Rupert Cassidy was 45 years old, heavyset, with a carefully maintained appearance that sat uneasily on a man whose eyes had the flat, calculating quality of something cold-blooded. He had come to Sweetwater Creek 2 years prior, ostensibly to pursue land investment, and had inserted himself into the commercial life of the town with a smoothness that many residents found charming and a few, Louis Bailey among them, found concerning. He had interests in the Red Ace Saloon and several other properties, and had been actively pursuing the Hendricks plot claim, not because the land was uniquely valuable, but because it shared a boundary with Bailey Ranch, and Cassidy had developed a particular fixation on undermining Louis Bailey's holdings. The history between Louis Bailey and Rupert Cassidy was one of those foundational grievances that shaped everything around it. 5 years prior, before the Clara Holt disaster had arrived to redefine Louis's understanding of betrayal, it had been Cassidy who had first tried to purchase the Hendricks land through Harold Graves by forging an early letter of intent that Louis claimed he had written first. The dispute had never been fully resolved in court, partly because Graves had kept contradictory records, and partly because Cassidy had the legal resources to make any proceeding lengthy and expensive. When Cassidy came into the land office on the 9th day after Lillian's arrival and introduced himself with his most charming manner, Lillian received him politely and gave away nothing. "I understand you've been reviewing the Hendricks plot file," Cassidy said, standing in front of her desk with his hat in his hands and his flat eyes working through a performance of pleasantness. "I've been reviewing all pending files," Lillian said, without looking up from her ledger. "Thorough," Cassidy said, in a tone that made the word sound like a challenge. "I've had an interest in that property for some time. Mr. Graves and I had a private understanding about the matter." "Private understandings are difficult to act upon," Lillian said, "when Mr. Graves is not available to confirm them. I've requested a formal ruling from the county seat. The resolution will be based on the documented record." Cassidy's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked at her for a moment with the appraising quality of a man recalculating a situation. "And I understand you have a personal connection to Mr. Bailey," he said. Lillian set down her pen and looked at him directly for the first time. "My professional assessment of this file will be based on the documented record," she said again, with an evenness that was a warning calmly delivered. Cassidy left. Lillian watched him go and felt a cold, instinctive discomfort that she filed away in the back of her mind, alongside everything else she could not yet fully account for. That evening, as she was closing the land office, Louis Bailey arrived on horseback and tied his animal to the post outside with a deliberateness that suggested he had decided something. "Miss Dawson," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which she had already learned was something he did when he was uncertain, though she did not yet know him well enough to know what that uncertainty meant. "Mr. Bailey," she said. He came inside, and she expected him to say what he had clearly been working himself up to say for the past 10 days, that there had been a mistake about the contract, that she had misread it, that they were not in fact intended to be married. She had been braced for this conversation since the second day, when she had started to have quiet, private doubts about her own interpretation of the document, and had gone back over it twice more and arrived each time at the same conclusion, which she had made herself believe was correct because the alternative was too frightening to accept. But Louis did not say any of that. He said, "Cassidy came to see you today." "He did," she said. "What did he want?" "To assess me," she said simply, and she watched something shift in his expression, a quickening of that guarded attention she was beginning to recognize. "He is not a safe man," Louis said. "I gathered that," she said. "He is attempting to use a claimed private understanding with Mr. Graves to support his competing claim on the Hendricks plot. I've requested a formal ruling from Amarillo." Louis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the correct approach." "I know," she said, and the words were flat and confident, and he found himself almost smiling. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was the first time he had sat down in this office, and they talked about the Hendricks plot for an hour. She asked precise questions. He gave precise answers. By the end of it, they had mapped out a clear argument for why his original letter of intent, properly documented and filed before Cassidy's claim, should carry legal precedence, and she had drafted the framework of the formal submission to the county seat. When he left, riding back out toward the ranch in the purple dusk, Louis Bailey spent the entire ride in a conversation with himself about why he had not said what he had come to say. The answer, which he was not ready to name directly, was that he did not want to. He did not want to correct the misunderstanding because Lillian Dawson was the first person in 5 years who had sat across from him and spoken to him like an equal, with directness and intelligence, and without either deference or agenda. He did not want to correct it because the idea of her leaving Sweetwater Creek now felt, inconveniently and impossibly, like something he could not easily contemplate. He did not want to correct it because, for the first time in years, he was finding himself thinking about another person during the hours when he was not with them, which was a development that alarmed him considerably. He also, buried under all of that, did not correct it because somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded uncomfortably like wisdom said that the misunderstanding, however it had arisen, had given both of them something they needed, even if neither of them had asked for it. He pushed that voice away and went to sleep and dreamed, for the first time in years, of something other than the flat, empty dark. The second week brought a change in weather. The relentless heat of early July broke slightly under the influence of afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the panhandle and turned the creek at the edge of town from a dry whisper to a genuine flow of brown, rushing water. The smell of the land after rain was something Lillian, who had grown up in city air, found unexpectedly moving, as if the earth was releasing something it had been holding in strict reserve. She had established herself at the boarding house run by a widow named Martha Chen, a formidable woman of Chinese heritage who had come to Texas with her late husband during the cattle boom of the 1870s, and had, after his death, turned the family home into a boarding establishment with brisk competence and a complete indifference to social opinion. Martha Chen was one of the few people in Sweetwater Creek who had noted the Louis Bailey situation and made no comment whatsoever, which Lillian appreciated enormously. Louis came to town on Tuesday and Thursday, as was his habit. On Tuesdays, he handled supply orders and banking. On Thursdays, he came to the land office, which was a variation from his previous pattern, and which the town noted with the quiet, careful attention it gave to departures from established routine. They did not discuss the contract again during those weeks. It existed between them like something that had been set on a high shelf, present and occasionally visible, but not currently under active examination. They talked about the Hendricks case, and about the condition of the range following the rain, and about a dispute between two neighboring ranchers over a fence line that was generating considerable paperwork, and about books, which they discovered they had both read in apparently incongruous quantities given their respective circumstances. Louis had educated himself, as he had done everything, through sheer stubborn will and an extensive mail-order account with a bookseller in Dallas. Lillian had educated herself through the public library in St. Louis and the second-hand book dealers on Chestnut Street, and a memory that retained things with the fidelity of a well-kept record. They disagreed, with increasing frequency and increasing pleasure, about almost everything they read. Louis had a frontier pragmatist skepticism about romanticism and idealism. Lillian had a bookkeeper's respect for precision, but a private, carefully guarded belief in the capacity of people to be better than their circumstances. They argued about Charles Dickens, whom Louis thought was overly sentimental and Lillian thought was morally essential. They argued about Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom Lillian found abstractly beautiful and Louis found uselessly detached from material reality. They argued, at considerable length and with great energy, about whether the heroes of Walter Scott's novels were actually admirable or merely impressive, which was a distinction Lillian considered crucial, and Louis initially thought was hair-splitting, and eventually, one Thursday afternoon in the land office with rain drumming on the roof, conceded was actually a meaningful difference. He conceded it by saying, quietly, "You're right," and she looked up from her ledger and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and faintly wondering, and her heart did something it had not done in a very long time. She looked back at her ledger. Her hand was not entirely steady. This was also the week when Rupert Cassidy escalated. The formal submission to the county seat had gone out, and Cassidy had been informed by Amarillo that the matter would be reviewed by the Circuit Land Commissioner, a man named Judge Thomas Abernathy, who was scheduled to visit Sweetwater Creek in 6 weeks to adjudicate several pending land matters. Cassidy had filed a legal objection to Lillian's submission on the grounds that a land office employee had no standing to file on behalf of a private claimant. This was, legally speaking, a fair point, and it created a problem. Lillian brought this to Louis on the following Thursday with the objection letter and a carefully composed expression that concealed a frustration she was allowing herself to feel privately but not professionally. "He is correct that I cannot file on your behalf in an official capacity," she said. "The submission needs to come from you directly, or from a lawyer acting on your behalf." "There is no lawyer in Sweetwater Creek," Louis said, which was true. The nearest attorney was 60 miles east in a town called Red Branch. "Then the submission needs to come from you directly," she said. "I will draft it. You will sign it and file it under your own name." "Cassidy will challenge it on other grounds," Louis said. He was standing by the window, looking out at the main street with his arms crossed in the posture she was beginning to recognize as the one he adopted when he was working through something unpleasant. "He will challenge it regardless," she said. "But a properly documented submission from you as the original letter of intent holder, supported by the dated correspondence records I have identified in Mr. Graves's files, gives you a strong case." Cassidy's preemption claim rests on a document that was filed 2 months after your letter of intent. If the dates on your original letter can be verified, his claim is substantially weakened. "And if they can be challenged," she was quiet for a moment, "then we need to find the witnesses who can confirm the timeline, who was present when you submitted your original letter of intent to Mr. Graves." Louis turned from the window. "Cecil Prout was the clerk that day, and there was another man there, a surveyor named Elias Webb." "Where is Elias Webb now?" "He left Sweetwater Creek last autumn. He is in a town called Colton, I believe, about 40 miles south." Lillian wrote the name in her ledger. "I will write to him," she said. "We need his written statement confirming the date." Louis looked at her with that direct, gray-eyed attention that she was still not entirely accustomed to. "You have done more for this case in 2 weeks than Graves did in a year," he said. "Mr. Graves had many competing demands on his attention," she said, which was charitable, because from what she had seen of Harold Graves's filing system, the man's primary method of document management had been geological strata. Something shifted in the air between them. Louis moved from the window, came to stand beside her desk, and looked down at the map she had spread across it showing the land parcels in question. He leaned forward to trace the boundary line between the Bailey Ranch and the Hendricks plot, and his hand was close to hers on the paper, and neither of them moved away from the proximity. "This line here," he said, indicating the eastern boundary of the Hendricks plot, "runs along the creek bed for about a 1/4 mile before it turns north. That section is where the dispute originates." Cassidy's preemption claim is based on the argument that his grandfather settled east of this line in 1851, which would have established a territorial right. But the creek bed has moved since then. What used to be east of the original boundary is now, by the creek's current course, west. Lillian studied the map. "Do you have evidence of the creek's movement? Survey records from the 1850s or 1860s? "There is a survey map from 1863 in the county records in Amarillo," he said. "I have never been able to obtain a copy." She looked up at him, and their faces were close enough that she could see the specific shade of gray in his eyes, which was not cold gray but something more like the sky just before dawn. "Write to Amarillo," she said. "Request a certified copy of that survey. If the 1863 map shows the creek's original course, it will establish that Cassidy's claimed boundary marker falls within what is now the Hendricks plot itself, not outside it. Louis was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her, not at the map. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "No one," she said honestly. "I read everything I could find, and I have a particular fondness for precision." He straightened up, and she felt the distance return between them, the careful, habitual distance he carried like a piece of equipment. But he was almost smiling again, and that was worth more than she would have admitted to anyone. 3 days later, Rupert Cassidy made a move that was not about the law at all. He approached Martha Chen with an offer to purchase her boarding house, at a price that was above market value, and came with the condition that she would give Cassidy 6 weeks to take possession. Martha Chen, who owned her property outright and had no interest in selling under any circumstances, declined with the courtesy of a woman who knew an implied threat when she heard one. But she told Lillian that evening at dinner, with the calm completeness of someone delivering an intelligence report. "He wants you moved before the commissioner arrives," Martha said, setting down a plate of cornbread with unnecessary firmness. "No stable address, no professional standing in the town." Lillian absorbed this. "He is trying to destabilize my position before the hearing. He is trying to run you out of town," Martha said, with the precision of a woman who had dealt with men trying to run her out of various places for 2 decades, and had achieved considerable expertise in the subject. Lillian told Louis on Thursday. She had expected him to respond with the controlled, contained manner she had come to understand as his default mode. Instead, he was very still for a moment, and then he said, with a quietness that was not calm but was the thing that sits just below it, "He will not succeed." "Martha declined the offer," Lillian said. "She is not moving." "I know Martha Chen," Louis said. "She has not moved for men considerably more formidable than Rupert Cassidy, but he will try other avenues. He is not a man who accepts a single refusal as a final answer." "Neither am I," Lillian said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "I know." The way he said it was not a compliment exactly. It was something more like a recognition, the acknowledgement of something he had observed and formed a settled opinion about. And the quality of that recognition was more affecting than any polished praise she had ever received. She went home that evening and sat in her room at Martha Chen's boarding house and thought, with the methodical honesty she applied to everything, about what was happening to her, about the contract, about the misunderstanding that she had built her present stability on, about the fact that she had, in the quiet hours when she was being fully truthful, been going back over that document with the growing, uncomfortable awareness that her first interpretation might not have been correct. She got the document out from the bottom of her trunk where she had placed it after that first day. She sat on the edge of her bed in the lamplight and read it again, all 4 pages, every clause, every conditional phrase. This time, reading it without the lens of fear and desperation, the legal language resolved into different meaning. The covenant of permanent union was, she now saw clearly, a property law holdover meaning nothing more than a joint deed. The provision and obligation clauses were mutual maintenance requirements for shared land, not a promise of matrimonial support. The cover letter's reference to the party traveling from St. Louis could easily refer to a business associate rather than a bride. She read it a 3rd time and felt the floor shift again, but in a very different direction than it had 3 weeks ago. She had misread it. She had been certain, but she had been wrong. The contract was a land partnership document, not a marriage agreement, and the understanding it established between Louis Bailey and the unnamed party from St. Louis had nothing to do with marriage at all. Lillian sat very still for a long time. Then she thought about Louis Bailey standing in the land office that first afternoon when she had told him, with all the desperate certainty she possessed, that they were to be married. She thought about the expression on his face, the very specific quality of his silence, the way he had looked at her and at the paper and back at her again and said nothing deliberately. She now understood. Had known. He had read his copy of that draft contract and understood exactly what it said, and he had looked at her with her mended dress and her shaking hands and her fragile, furious certainty, and he had not corrected her. He had let her believe it. The anger arrived. It was cold and clean and precise, the way all of Lillian's strongest feelings were precise, and it organized itself into a single clear question. Why? She did not go to him that night. She did not go the next day. She sat with the question and the anger and the beginning of something else that she was not yet ready to name, something that ran alongside the anger like a second river parallel to the first, and she thought about everything that had happened in the 3 weeks since her arrival in Sweetwater Creek. Every conversation, every Thursday afternoon in the land office, every moment of being seen and known and treated as capable and intelligent and worth engaging with. She thought about the way he had said, "Neither am I," in response to her saying she was not a man who accepted a single refusal as a final answer. She thought about Clara Holt, whose history she had gathered in pieces from the ambient conversation of the town, the woman who had left Louis Bailey for a cattle broker from Abilene and taken something essential with her when she went. She thought about the walls she had seen, and without quite realizing what she was doing, had been patient with. She thought about a man who had looked at a desperate woman and chosen, silently, not to take away the one thing that was keeping her together. And alongside the anger, which was justified and would need to be addressed, she held this other thing. This other thing that was not yet ready to be named but was undeniably present. She went to him on a Saturday morning, which was not a day he came to town, which meant she had to ride out to the ranch, which required borrowing the elderly mare that Martha Chen kept in a small paddock behind the boarding house. She had never been to Bailey Ranch. She followed the directions she had extrapolated from the land maps and found the main gate after an hour's riding through country that became progressively less like her idea of Texas and more like something she had no adequate existing category for. The land opened up under the enormous sky, and the grass, dried to pale gold by the summer, moved in the hot morning wind in long, continuous waves that had a rhythm to it, and the sky above was so immense and so blue that it felt less like a ceiling and more like the beginning of space itself. She did not have room in her current internal state for the beauty of it, but it pressed itself on her attention regardless. The ranch house was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something functional and spare. What she found was a large, well-built house of limestone and timber with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, with 2 old cottonwood trees shading it on either side, with flower beds along the foundation that were clearly an act of deliberate care rather than accident. Someone tended those flower beds. She filed this observation away. Louis came out onto the porch when she rode up, having apparently seen her coming across the open ground. He stood with his arms at his sides, and his expression showing her something she had not seen before, something that looked very much like a man braced for a difficult truth. She tied the mare to the post and came up the porch steps and stopped in front of him. "I reread the contract," she said. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that was equal parts relief and something that might have been fear, which from a man of his composed self-possession was extraordinary. "I know," he said. "You knew from the beginning," she said. "You knew that day in the land office." He held her gaze. "Yes." "Why?" she said, and the word was flat and clean and carried the full weight of the question. He was silent for a moment. A ranch hand moved somewhere distant behind the house, and a horse called from the corral, and the hot wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, and Louis Bailey stood on his porch and looked at Lillian Dawson and assembled the truth out of the components he had been refusing to examine for 3 weeks. "Because you looked like someone who had been fighting alone for so long that you had forgotten there was any other way," he said quietly. "Because you were holding that paper like it was the last solid thing in the world. And because I knew that if I corrected you, you would leave. You would have nowhere to go and no reason to stay, and you would walk out of that office and I would never see you again." The silence that followed was enormous. "That is not a sufficient justification for deceiving me," Lillian said. "No," he said, "it is not. I have been operating under a false assumption for 3 weeks. I have been making decisions about my life and my future based on something that was not true. Yes, You should have corrected me the moment I said it. Yes, she looked at him. He did not flinch, did not look away, did not offer additional excuses. He held her gaze and absorbed her anger with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, completely and without reservation, and it was this, more than anything, that began to shift something in the architecture of her fury. "Explain to me," she said, "what the contract actually is." He explained it. All of it. The Hendricks plot, the competing claims, Patricia Hadley from St. Louis, the joint deed arrangement. He explained Harold Graves's cover letter, and how it had been intended for a business context that bore no resemblance to the personal context in which Lillian had read it. He explained it clearly and completely, without softening any part that was inconvenient for him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is Mrs. Patricia Hadley?" "A land investor from St. Louis. She and Graves had been in correspondence for about 8 months. After Graves died, the arrangement dissolved. So the blank space in the second party line was for her." "Yes." Lillian looked out at the rolling pale gold grass, at the enormous sky. "What happens now?" she said. "That is your choice to make," Louis said. "You know the truth now. If you wish to leave Sweetwater Creek, I will ensure that you have enough money to go wherever you need to go. That is the least I owe you." "And if I don't wish to leave?" she said. He looked at her with that dawn sky gray gaze. "Then I would ask you to stay," he said. "Not under any false premise, not because of a misread contract or a misunderstood cover letter, but because this town needs someone like you in that land office, and because I am beginning to understand that I need someone like you in my life, and I would rather say that plainly and have you refuse me honestly than lose the chance to say it at all." Lillian absorbed this. "You nearly cost me my dignity," she said. "I know, and my professional credibility if the town had discovered the misunderstanding. I know, and you did it for a reason that was entirely selfish." "Yes," he said. "And I would do anything to be able to go back and handle it differently because you deserved better than that. You deserved to be told the truth from the first moment, and you deserved to make your own choice with complete information, and I deprived you of that. I am sorry. That is not a sufficient apology for what I did, but it is an honest one." The morning had moved toward midday. The cottonwood leaves shifted. Lillian stood on the porch of a house she had thought was going to be her home, and looked at the man who had let her believe a beautiful lie because he could not bear to take it away from her, and made a decision. "I will stay in Sweetwater Creek," she said. "I will continue my work at the land office. I will pursue the Hendricks plot case on your behalf because that is my professional responsibility and because it is the right outcome. And we will begin again from an honest starting point, and we will see what develops naturally without any false premises." Louis Bailey was quiet for a long moment. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." But she did not leave. She accepted the coffee he offered and sat on his porch in the hot morning, and they talked for 3 hours about everything except what had just passed between them. And neither of them needed to say anything about it because it was in the air of the porch like the smell of rain-soaked earth, present and unignorable and full of something that had not been there before. When she rode back to town that afternoon, Louis watched her go from the porch until the gold grass closed over the distance and she disappeared, and he stood there for a long time afterward feeling, for the first time in 5 years, that the future was not simply a thing to be managed, but something it might actually be possible to want. The weeks that followed were, in several important ways, the most significant of both their lives. The response from Elias Webb arrived first, a careful letter from the surveyor in Colton, confirming the date of Louis's original filing with Harold Graves. Webb's letter was clear and specific and signed, with the formality of a man who understood he was writing a legal document. Lillian incorporated it into the formal submission to Amarillo and sent the complete package to Judge Abernathy's office with a covering letter that outlined the evidentiary argument with a clarity that even Cecil Prout, reviewing it before it went out, described as very thorough indeed, which was the highest compliment his vocabulary allowed. The survey map from 1863 arrived from Amarillo 2 weeks later, a large, careful drawing on yellowed paper that showed the original course of the creek bed, with an explicitness that was almost dramatically convenient. The original boundary line of the Hendricks plot was clearly east of the original creek course, which meant that Cassidy's grandfather's settlement, even if it had occurred as Cassidy claimed, had been on the east side of a boundary that was firmly and documentably within the plot's original jurisdiction. The preemption right, even if genuine, attached to land that was itself within the Hendricks plot, not adjacent to it, which inverted the entire foundation of Cassidy's claim. Lillian laid the 1863 map on her desk beside the current survey and spent an afternoon cross-referencing every reference point she could identify, making notes in her precise, small handwriting, building an argument that was, when she was finished, essentially unassailable. Louis came in that Thursday and she showed him the maps and walked him through the argument, and he stood beside her desk and followed her analysis point by point and at the end said, "He has no case," with a flatness that was not triumph but something more like the satisfaction of a long-standing injustice finally resolved. "Not a viable one," she confirmed. "He may still contest the commissioner's ruling, but the documented evidence is decisive." "You built this," he said. "We built it," she said. "Your original letter of intent, your memory of the witnesses, your knowledge of the creek's movement. I organized the argument, but the substance was yours." He looked at her. "Lillian," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the way he said it was not practiced or deliberate but was simply the word that came naturally, the word that fit, and she felt it in a way that was entirely physical and entirely inconvenient and entirely honest. "Louis," she said, and watched something move through his expression like weather across the plains. Outside, Cassidy was less accepting of the situation than the evidence recommended. When word reached him through the efficient grapevine of small-town gossip that Lillian had obtained the 1863 survey map, he came to the land office with a lawyer he had retained in Amarillo, a thin man named Crawford who carried a leather case and a proprietary air, and they sat down across from Lillian's desk and attempted to argue that the 1863 map was of uncertain provenance and should not be admitted as evidence. Lillian listened to this argument with complete composure and then said, quietly and precisely, that the 1863 survey map had been conducted by the United States government under the General Land Office Act of 1862, that it bore the official seal of the Surveyor General's office in Amarillo, that it had been certified upon her request by the current county land office as an official government record, and that any challenge to its provenance would require Mr. Crawford to substantiate his doubts against the authority of the United States federal government, which she wished him the very best in attempting. Crawford looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his leather case. Then he said he would need to consult with his client, and they left. Cassidy came back alone the next morning without the lawyer. He stood in the doorway and looked at Lillian with the flat, cold quality of a man who has run out of professional options and is considering which unprofessional ones remain available. "You are making a significant enemy," he said. "I am doing my job," she said. "There is more than one kind of pressure that can be brought to bear on a situation like this," he said. She set down her pen and looked at him with the same direct attention she had given him the first day. "Mr. Cassidy," she said, "I'm a woman alone in a frontier town who arrived here 6 weeks ago with nothing. I have already survived the worst you can do by implication. I suggest that you consult with your attorney about the relative merits of your remaining legal options and leave the other kind of pressure in the category of things you have thought about but are too intelligent to attempt." It was a calculated risk, calling his intelligence a restraint rather than his decency, but she had read him correctly. He was a man who thought of himself as shrewd, and being told he was too intelligent to do something intemperate was more effective than being told he was too decent. He left. He did not come back directly. He came back indirectly, in the form of a rumor that began circulating through Sweetwater Creek in the third week of August, a rumor about Lillian Dawson and the Misread contract, and the entirely false claim that she and Louis Bailey were engaged to be married. The rumor, as Cassidy had shaped it, was not framed sympathetically. It was framed as a deception, a clever scheme by a scheming woman to attach herself to one of the county's most substantial landowners on the basis of a forged or misrepresented document. Lillian heard about it on a Wednesday evening from Martha Chen, who delivered the intelligence over supper with the directness of a woman who considered it more useful to confront unpleasant realities than to pretend they did not exist. Lillian sat with her soup untouched and felt the cold, particular weight of being a woman in a world where the narrative about you was not always the one you had written. She went to Louis the next morning, which was Thursday, and told him before he could even sit down. He was very still when she finished. "He is trying to use the misunderstanding as a weapon," he said. "Yes," she said. "And the only way to neutralize it is to address it directly and publicly." Louis looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to be honest," she said, which was the thing she had always wanted, the thing that the false premise had cost her. "I want to tell the town the truth about what happened. I misread the contract. I believed it was a marriage agreement when it was not. That is the complete truth, and I will say so plainly. And what becomes of you professionally if you do that?" He said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "My professional credibility rests on the quality of my work," she said, "not on the absence of a mistake. If the town judges me unfit for this position because I misread a legal document once, then this is not a situation that was going to last regardless. But I don't believe that. I believe most people in this town understand that an honest admission of error is more credible than a convenient silence." Louis was quiet for a long moment. He was standing by the window again, with his arms at his sides this time rather than crossed, and the morning light was behind him, and Lillian was looking at him and thinking, with the precision she applied to everything, that she was more than halfway in love with this man and had been for at least 2 weeks and had been refusing to acknowledge it because acknowledging it felt like the most vulnerable thing she had ever done. "Let me handle this," Louis said. She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I would like to address Cassidy's rumor myself," he said. He turned from the window and came to stand in front of her desk, not behind it, not beside it, but directly in front of it, and he looked at her with the most direct, unguarded expression she had seen on his face. "Lillian, there is something I would like to ask you, and I would like you to hear the whole of it before you answer." She was very still. "I am listening. I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the contract and not to address a rumor, and not because I owe you anything, though I understand that I do. I would like to ask you because you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and because the past 6 weeks have made me understand that the walls I have been maintaining are not a form of wisdom but a form of cowardice, and because I am, whether I intended it or not, entirely in love with you." The silence in the land office was complete. "That is a significant declaration," Lillian said, and her voice was very nearly steady. "I know," he said. "We have known each other for 6 weeks. I know. I am currently managing a dispute on your behalf in a professional capacity. I know," he said. "And I will arrange alternative representation for the Hendricks hearing if you think the professional complication is insurmountable. I am not asking you to compromise your work. I am asking you, entirely separately from your work, whether you might be willing to build something with me, not from a misread contract, not from a mistake, from a choice." Lillian looked at him for a very long moment. She thought about the man she had come to know in 6 weeks of Thursday afternoons and occasional Saturday mornings, and the accumulated evidence of who Louis Bailey actually was, not the closed-off, solitary figure the town described, but the man who read Dickens and tended flower beds and paid his workers fairly, and had looked at a frightened woman holding a misread contract and chosen, with whatever complicated mixture of motives, not to take her last hope from her. She thought about her own life, The years of managing alone, the competence she had built like armor, the way she had kept her own heart at the same careful distance Louis kept everything. She thought about how it had felt those Thursday afternoons to be genuinely seen. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet and clear and absolute. Louis exhaled. It was the smallest sound, barely audible over the ambient noise of the summer morning, but she heard it clearly, the sound of a man setting down something very heavy that he had been carrying for a long time. He extended his hand across the desk. She looked at it and then looked at him and then, in a departure from every careful professional habit she had built in the past 6 weeks, placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and steady and held her hand like something he intended to keep. "We should address the rumor," she said. "We will," he said. "But this first." He came around the desk. He stood in front of her and she stood up and they were closer than they had ever been, and he raised her hand to his lips with a deliberateness that was nothing like haste, and the gesture was formal and tender and full of the particular quality of a man who had been deciding for some time that if he was going to do something, he was going to do it with his full attention. She felt it from the point of contact straight through to the center of her chest. They addressed the rumor. Louis went to the Red Ace Saloon the following evening, which was a rare enough event that it generated immediate attention, and he stood at the bar and said, to the assembled company of Sweetwater Creek, that he wished to clarify a matter that had become the subject of unfortunate speculation. He said that Lillian Dawson had arrived in Sweetwater Creek with a misreading of a legal document that was an honest mistake made under difficult circumstances, and that reflected no dishonesty on her part. He said that the error had not been corrected as promptly as it should have been, and that the responsibility for that delay lay entirely with him. He said that he had asked Miss Dawson to marry him and that she had agreed, and that this was not the result of any document, misread or otherwise, but was the result of his having had the good fortune to meet a person of extraordinary character and intelligence who had been generous enough to give him a second opinion on his own situation. There was a silence when he finished. Then someone at the back of the room, a rancher named Beaumont who had known Louis Bailey for 15 years, said, "Well, it is about time," and there was laughter that was entirely without malice, and the rumor was not so much refuted as replaced, which was a more complete solution. Rupert Cassidy was not in the saloon that evening. He was told about it the next morning by his hired man, and he sat with this information for 2 days and then, on the Monday before Judge Abernathy was due to arrive, came to the land office one final time. "I will withdraw my claim," he said, without preamble. Lillian looked up from her ledger. "I beg your pardon." "My attorney has advised me that the evidentiary record is conclusive," Cassidy said, with the tight, flat quality of a man swallowing something bitter. "I am withdrawing my competing claim on the Hendricks plot." Lillian looked at him steadily. "I will require that withdrawal in writing, filed formally with this office before the hearing date." "You will have it," he said. He left. He did not say anything else. He had calculated that a contested hearing with a documented evidentiary record as decisive as Lillian had built would not only fail but would expose the weakness of his original preemption claim in a way that could unwind other legal strategies he had in play. It was, in the end, a pragmatic decision dressed up as a concession. Lillian sat in the silence after he left and felt, for the first time since arriving in Sweetwater Creek, something completely settled. She wrote to Louis immediately, and he came that afternoon and she told him the news, and he stood in the middle of the land office with his hat in his hands, and she watched the news move through him like something physical, the release of a tension that had been present so long he had learned not to feel it. "It's done," he said. "It will be done when the withdrawal is filed," she said. "I'm not taking anything as concluded until I have paper evidence." He looked at her with warmth and amusement, and something so purely fond that she felt it in the same place. She always felt his particular brand of attention. "Of course," he said. "The withdrawal was filed on Wednesday." The Hendricks plot was transferred to Louis Bailey's name by Judge Abernathy at the hearing the following week, in a proceeding that lasted approximately 40 minutes and was entirely uncontested. Abernathy signed the transfer document with the brisk efficiency of a man who had prepared for a lengthy dispute and was pleasantly surprised to find none, and Sweetwater Creek's most protracted land dispute was resolved. Lillian and Louis were married in October of 1882. The ceremony was held in the small church that the pastor insisted on calling a cathedral, on a morning that had broken cool and clear after 3 days of rain. The pastor, a man named Reverend Howard who had been hoping for exactly this development since approximately the second Thursday Louis had come to the land office, conducted the service with considerable enthusiasm. Martha Chen sat in the second row and did not cry, but she pressed her lips together several times in a way that suggested the effort involved. Cecil Prout was there, looking pink and pleased. The rancher Beaumont and several of Louis's ranch hands occupied 3 pews with the benevolent solidarity of people who feel they have a personal stake in a happy outcome. Lillian wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen carefully at the general store, a blue-gray wool that was the color of winter sky, and which fit her well, because she had had the time and the patience to get it right. She had flowers in her hair from the general store's small supply of dried flowers, and she walked down the aisle of the cathedral church with the unhurried composure of a woman who was absolutely certain about her decision, and wanted the occasion to be appropriate to that certainty. Louis was waiting at the front in a dark coat that he had clearly acquired specifically for the occasion, with a white shirt and a somber dignity that broke into something entirely different when he saw her, something that was still dignified but was also unmistakably, helplessly happy. And Lillian saw it, and felt her own composure develop an interesting fault line that she managed to keep closed through sheer force of will, until the vows were exchanged, and then abandoned entirely as a project. The vows they had written themselves. This had been Lillian's idea, and Louis had agreed immediately, with the specific quality of agreement that meant he had been thinking the same thing. She said things that were precise and true and spoke to knowing him rather than to the idea of him. He said things that were quieter and went deeper than anything the town of Sweetwater Creek had expected from a man it had categorized as irreparably self-contained. And there was a sound from the congregation that was not quite audible but was felt. He kissed her with the same deliberate, full-attention quality he gave to everything, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and Reverend Howard declared them married with a satisfaction that suggested he was filing this event permanently in the success column. They had a reception at the Red Ace, which was the largest interior space in Sweetwater Creek, and which the owner had been persuaded to clear of its more professionally specific ambience for the afternoon. There was food from the general store and 3 neighbors who had contributed to the feast, and there was music from a fiddler named Pete Alvarez who could play for 4 hours without repeating himself, and there was dancing on the plank floor of the saloon under lanterns that swung in the draft from the open doors. Louis danced with Lillian 4 times, which in the accounting of Sweetwater Creek was approximately 3 more times than anyone had expected, and which was noted and discussed with tremendous satisfaction by everyone present. When they rode out to the Bailey Ranch in the cool October evening, with the stars coming out above the flat dark horizon and the horses moving at a comfortable pace through the good Texas grass, Lillian looked out at the country that was now hers and felt something settle into place with the finality of a foundation stone being laid. "I have been thinking about the flower beds," she said. Louis glanced at her in the dimness. "What about them?" "I would like to add to them in spring," she said. "I have ideas about what would grow well here." He was quiet for a moment. "I planted those flower beds the year after my father died," he said. "He always said the house needed them. I never had anyone to tell." She understood what he was saying beneath the words, which was that he was telling her something he had not told anyone. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way to the ranch in the kind of silence that is not empty, but is full to the point of not requiring additional filling. The house welcomed her. This was a thought she recognized as probably sentimental and did not retract, because it was simply the accurate description of how it felt when she walked through the front door that evening and saw the lamps they had lit before leaving for the church that morning still casting their warm light, and the shelves of books, and the stone hearth, and the flower beds dark and sleeping outside the window. She was home. They learned each other the way two careful, intelligent people learn each other when they have decided to be genuinely honest, which is slowly and sometimes painfully, and with an increasing depth of understanding that accumulates the way wealth accumulates, slowly at first, and then with a momentum that is its own kind of wonder. They disagreed about things, regularly and productively, because they were too alike in their precision to let inaccuracies stand uncorrected even in low-stakes conversations. They read to each other on winter evenings, which was something neither of them had done with anyone before, and which proved to be the most comfortable and intimate experience either could have described. Louis read with a dry, careful diction. Lillian read with expressive attention, to the rhythms of a sentence that made even the Emerson passages Louis objected to sound worth considering. He told her about Clara Holt one evening in November, 3 weeks into their marriage, unprompted, sitting by the fire with the wind outside and the lamp on the table between them. He told it without self-pity and without drama, the plain account of a man who had loved someone who had not loved him with the same quality of constancy, and who had built walls afterward not from bitterness but from a particular private shame at having been seen wanting something and found lacking. Lillian listened to the whole of it. Then she said, "The shame was not yours to carry." "I know that now," he said. "She made a choice that was about her needs, not your worth," she said. "You decided her choice was a verdict on your value." He was quiet for a moment. "You do not soften things," he said. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said, and the way he said it was absolute. "I spent 5 years with nothing but softened, imprecise things. I did not know how hungry I was for the other kind until you." She told him about her father, about the years of managing and covering and carrying a household on the patience of a 12-year-old girl who became a 20-year-old woman, and then a 24-year-old who had learned competence so thoroughly it had become a kind of isolation. She told him about the advertisement and the terror and the Misread contract, and what it had felt like, in that airless land office in July, to be so frightened that she had let herself see what she needed to see in a legal document rather than what was actually there. He listened to the whole of it. Then he said, "I should have corrected you, and I should have told you the truth sooner than I did, but I am glad you are here." "I am glad I am here," she said. They looked at each other across the fire, and both of them understood that this was the honest ground they had been building toward from the beginning, the place where the false premise had been cleared away, and what remained was something that needed no misreading because it said exactly what it meant. In the spring of 1883, Lillian added to the flower beds as she had planned. She planted roses along the east side of the house, which got the best morning sun, and a row of lavender along the porch foundation, and a kitchen garden behind the house with vegetables and the herbs she had identified in her reading as growing well in the Texas climate. Louis helped with the planting on a Sunday afternoon in April with the easy, unhurried quality of a man who had decided that the things he had previously classified as unnecessary were in fact essential, and they worked side by side in the dirt with the spring sky enormous and blue above them, and the ranch hands giving the house a wide berth out of the particular tact of people who recognize a moment worth not interrupting. In July of 1883, exactly 1 year after Lillian Dawson had arrived in Sweetwater Creek on the eastbound stage with a mended dress and a scrap of paper and a desperate determination to make something out of nothing, she told Louis Bailey that they were going to have a child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, doing the entirely undramatic thing of pouring coffee, and the coffee went sideways when he turned to look at her, and he set the cup down carefully and came across the kitchen and put his hands on her face with a gentleness that was wholly incommensurate with the size of his hands, and said, "Are you certain?" "I have been careful and methodical about confirming it," she said, "as I am with everything." He laughed, which was something she had worked hard for in the early months and which now came more easily, a laugh that was warm and deep and entirely genuine. And he held her and she held him, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across both of them and the floor they were standing on. Their son was born in February of 1884, in the bedroom of the limestone ranch house, in the care of the town's doctor and Martha Chen, who had arrived in the buggy with her medical kit and her implacable competence before being strictly necessary, and had refused to leave until she was satisfied that everything was exactly as it should be. They named him George Arthur Bailey, the first name for Lillian's father, because she had loved him despite everything and forgiveness was something she had decided to practice, and the second name for Louis's father, Arthur Bailey, who had built the ranch and planted the first flower beds and told his son the house needed them. George Arthur Bailey was born with gray eyes, which Martha Chen noted with the satisfaction of someone who had expected as much, and with a substantial quantity of dark hair, which he had gotten from his mother. He was, from the first days of his life, a person of emphatic opinions expressed at considerable volume, which his mother found impressive and his father found entirely consistent with what he had come to expect from the Bailey household. Lillian continued her work at the land office for 2 years after the marriage, until the volume of work at the ranch itself had grown to the point where managing the books and contracts for Bailey Ranch alone was a full-time occupation. She handled the ranch's business affairs with the same organized precision she had brought to the land office, and the ranch's financial records were, by the time she had been managing them for a year, the cleanest and most thoroughly documented in the county. Louis, who had previously managed these matters in the direct but imprecise way of a man who understood operations better than administration, found the experience of having accurate, complete financial records to be genuinely revelatory. By 1885, Bailey Ranch had expanded again, taking in the Hendricks plot in full productive use, adding another 1,200 acres to the north in a clean purchase from a rancher who was returning east, and employing 22 men. Louis had negotiated a cattle supply contract with a buyer in Abilene that provided a stable income independent of the price fluctuations that made many ranching operations precarious. Lillian had structured the contract terms, negotiated the specifics in a correspondence that the Abilene buyer remembered for years afterward as the most precise and well-argued negotiation he had ever conducted by letter, and implemented the record-keeping system that ensured the contract was performed correctly on their end and verified on his. Rupert Cassidy had left Sweetwater Creek in the autumn of 1883, which nobody had mourned with any particular loudness. He had sold his interests in the Red Ace and his other properties and relocated to Amarillo, where he pursued his land investment activities in a larger arena. Louis and Lillian heard from him precisely once more, in 1886, when his attorney in Amarillo sent a letter attempting to resurrect a claims interest in a peripheral piece of the Bailey Ranch's north expansion. Lillian's response was so comprehensively documented, so precisely referenced, and so clearly designed to be forwarded directly to the relevant court if Cassidy chose to pursue the matter, that his attorney sent a brief reply indicating that the matter was considered closed. Cecil Prout had been replaced as the acting administrator of the Sweetwater Creek Land Office by a proper appointment from the county in the autumn of 1882, a man named Daniel Hartley, who was competent and earnest, and who had benefited enormously from the organizational systems Lillian had implemented during her months there. He came to Lillian occasionally with questions about specific files, which she answered with the same precision she gave to everything, and he sent a very nice wedding gift and attended George Arthur's christening. Martha Chen continued to operate her boarding house with the same brisk, formidable efficiency. She and Lillian had developed a friendship that was one of the steady constants of Sweetwater Creek life, conducted over shared meals and occasional afternoon visits, and a correspondence that continued through the periods when distance made visits impractical. Martha was George Arthur's unofficial godmother, a role she had awarded herself without waiting to be asked, and which no one had thought to question. In 1886, Lillian discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Louis in the barn, of all places, because she had been helping him assess a new horse they were considering, and the moment had arrived naturally, and she had learned, in 4 years of marriage, that the best moments were the ones that happened naturally. Louis had been crouching to examine the horse's hoof, and he stood up and turned around and looked at her with the gray eyes that she still found the most direct and honest gaze she had ever encountered, and said, "George will be beside himself." "George," she said, "will need to develop some flexibility in his expectations." "He will," Louis said with confidence. "He is your son." Their second child, a daughter, was born in March of 1887. They named her Clara Margaret Bailey, the first name for Louis's suggestion, which surprised Lillian until he explained that naming her Clara was not about his old wound, but about reclaiming a name he had once associated with loss, and giving it a new association, one that was entirely about forward motion. Margaret was for Lillian's mother. The daughter came into the world with her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and the same emphatic quality that characterized her brother, expressed in a frequency somewhat higher than his. George Arthur, who was 3 years old and had been earnestly anticipating a brother, took approximately 4 hours to adjust his expectations, and then attached himself to Clara Margaret with the wholehearted intensity of a person who has decided that whatever he has gotten is exactly what he wanted all along. The ranch in 1887 was a different thing from the 4,000-acre operation that Louis had been maintaining alone in 1882. It was a home. The flower beds had expanded every spring, and the roses along the east side of the house had established themselves into something magnificent. The kitchen garden had grown and become both productive and beautiful, in the way that things grown with consistent attention do. There were 2 cottonwood trees still shading the porch, and a third that Lillian had planted in the first spring, which was now tall enough to provide its own shade in the afternoon. The books had multiplied beyond any shelf system that could reasonably contain them, and had colonized the second bedroom and the parlor, and developed an organic arrangement that made complete sense to both Louis and Lillian and nobody else. On an evening in late spring of 1887, with the children asleep and the ranch quiet around them, Louis and Lillian sat on the porch in the warm dusk the way they sat most evenings when the work was done. In the 2 chairs they had set there for exactly this purpose, with the grassland running out before them in the last light, and the sky above doing its enormous Texas thing of going through 3 different shades of gold before settling into blue. Louis was reading. Lillian was holding Clara Margaret, who had decided the evening required her attendance, and was conducting a low, satisfied commentary on nothing in particular. George Arthur had gone to bed an hour ago with the self-important gravity of a 3-year-old who has decided he is old enough to conduct his own bedtime, a decision he implemented with varying degrees of success. "I have been thinking about the north pasture," Lillian said. Louis looked up from his book. "What about it?" "The fence line on the eastern edge needs replacing before winter," she said. "I had Diego look at it this week. 2 sections are down to 1 wire." "I will have him organize that this week," Louis said. "I also had an idea about the cattle supply contract renewal," she said. "The Abilene buyer's terms are current through the end of this year. I think we should approach the negotiation differently for the next period. The price structure he offered in '84 was favorable for him. The market has shifted enough that our position is stronger." Louis looked at her over his book with an expression that was familiar and entirely specific to these moments, a warmth that had accumulated over 5 years of exactly this kind of conversation, the practical and the personal woven together so completely that there was no longer a line between them. "You will write the proposal," he said. "I already have a draft," she said. He laughed. She felt it in the air beside her like something physical. Clara Margaret made an opinion known about something, and then settled back into her commentary. The dusk deepened around the porch of the Bailey Ranch, the limestone house with its flower beds and its roses and its cottonwood trees and its shelves of contentious books, and the grassland ran out toward a horizon that was wide and open, and full of the kind of space that could, if you let it, feel like possibility rather than emptiness. Lillian looked out at it and thought, with the precision she applied to everything, and the honesty she had committed to since that Saturday morning on the same porch when the truth had been laid out between them, and they had decided to build from it rather than from the beautiful, frightened mistake, that she was entirely, exactly, completely where she was supposed to be. Not because of a contract. Not because of a misread document and a desperate woman's hope, and a man's silence in a moment when truth should have been spoken, but because of everything that came after. Because of the choice made twice, once by a man who could not bear to take away her last hope, and once by a woman who had decided that the man who made that choice, flawed and human and honest about his flaws, was worth building a life with. Louis set down his book. He looked at her in the last of the evening light. This woman who had arrived in his town with nothing but competence and determination and a misread contract, who had built his ranch records into a model of clarity, who had won the Hendricks plot case with the force of pure precision, who had told him hard truths without softening them, who had planted roses along the east wall of his house and lavender along his porch and a kitchen garden behind, who had given him George Arthur and Clara Margaret and 5 years of the most fully inhabited life he had ever lived. "Lillian," he said. She looked at him. "I should have corrected you that day," he said. "I will never stop being glad that I did not." She considered this. She had thought about it many times from many angles, with the precision and the honesty that were the qualities she trusted most in herself. She had thought about what might have happened if he had corrected her, if she had walked out of the land office that afternoon with the truth and nothing else. She might have left. She might have found another position, in another town, and built something different and perhaps not lesser. She might have been just fine, but she would not have had this. And this, she had decided, was the specific and irreplaceable thing. "So should I," she said. "I will never stop being glad that I was wrong." He smiled. She smiled. The Texas evening settled around them in its particular way, enormous and warm and full of the smell of grass and the sounds of the ranch and the soft, specific noises of the children inside the house, and the roses along the east wall of the house that had grown into something magnificent, and the future that was not simply a thing to be managed, but a thing to be wanted. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, the two of them together in the good dark of the Panhandle, and the contract that had been misread, and the silence that had followed it, and the truth that had been built out of both of those things lay behind them, settled and finished, as solid and as permanent as the limestone walls of the house they had made into a home.